Hi, everybody, and welcome back. I want to say thank you for those of you who have been so diligent in turning in your work. It's nice to see some of your beautiful images. You're all doing very well, and I'm still excited to be teaching you some of these new principles. So here we are now starting Unit 2. This is our second lecture for the whole class, also the second unit. We're going to be talking about camera settings throughout this whole entire unit, and especially this lecture. And camera settings implies that we are going to have our cameras in manual mode. And that's the idea. And I have subtitled the lecture, Taking Creative Control of Your Images, because that is literally what will begin to happen once you begin to put your camera in manual mode and start going down that road. It's pretty exciting stuff. And so just to kind of give you the layout class-wise and maybe take care of a little bit of housekeeping before we jump in, although very little. Now that we've learned some important principles about composition with regard to our photography, what we're doing next is we are adding another layer to your knowledge along your photographic journeys, per se. So each of these units 1, 2, and 3, they're each meant to be used in conjunction with each other. So I don't want you to view Unit 2 as separate from Unit 1. We're not moving on from Unit 1. We are adding Unit 2 on top of Unit 1. And so with regard to that, let me just give you some expectations for this unit. First of all, the images that you're going to be submitting from now on, and especially in the next 3 weeks in Unit 2, you'll now need to have both the accompanying compositional descriptions, which you've already been doing as you've submitted your images, but as well as the camera settings that you're going to be using for each picture and why you use those settings. And so that second part there makes up what this lecture is all about. So one of the first big steps in your photography towards making it an art form is letting go of your camera's fully automatic mode. So what happens, the justification of that is that rather than your camera's microchip making all of the decisions, this is where you begin to take over the creative control of your photographs. This is really exciting stuff. It's a wonderful next step on your journey. And so let me just give a little bit of a disclaimer here, and that is, while I'll be showing you some examples for illustration purposes, it's important to understand that the location of your specific camera settings, where all the buttons and menus and things are on your camera, as well as how those settings function, for that matter, it's going to vary widely. And I would take the whole entire semester trying to show how every camera does that. And so there's so much diversity in how this is done with each camera. There's so many different ways in which different cameras are set up, and I don't mean just between brands such as Nikon, Canon, Fuji, Sony. Of course, those vary from brand to brand on where all these settings are and how they work that we're talking about. But I mean even within a particular brand. From model to model, these settings can vary greatly, and so it would be impossible for me to just tell you where your camera settings are for each and every one. And so if you do not have your camera handy, I'm going to encourage you to pause the video right now and go get your camera and have it handy, especially for the first part of the lecture coming up, because we are going to be going over some settings, and you are going to need to know where those settings are, and you're going to want it switched on manual mode. So I'll give you some time to just go ahead and do that. Actually, I don't need to give you time. You can just pause it. And but I want to encourage you to actually take a look at your owner's manual for your camera. I mean, here's mine for the Nikon D810. Just look how thick this thing is. I mean, and this is actually all in English. I got a second manual with my camera that has Spanish and some other languages in it. And so there can be a lot to it. And I realized that I just broke the man code by saying, read your instructions. But there's no other way for you to figure out exactly where some of these settings are. And so what I'm going to be going over with is what those settings are. And I'll give you some idea where they might be on the most common scenarios on cameras. But what I'm really going to get into with you is how those settings work to your advantage as a photographer. Okay, so we're gonna go ahead and move on now, and I want to talk to you. I'm assuming you have your camera with you, and I want to talk to you about where you might be able to find the manual mode settings on your camera. Now, the first image here you see on your left side of the screen. This is actually a iPhone shot of my Nikon D810, and with this particular model of Nikon, I would be holding down this mode button, and then my thumb would rest on this thumb wheel back here, which turns. And as I turn the thumb wheel, I'll get different modes in here: manual, automatic, aperture priority, shutter priority, all sorts of different modes depending on what your camera is. But I would do that until I found the manual mode. Now that's a very typical setup for Nikons and even some other. I know Sony's very similar to that. Here is an iPhone shot of my friend's Nikon, and this one, really, you're just kind of moving this wheel. You're turning this wheel out. Now I think there's a little locking mechanism so that you don't turn it by accident. You might have to press down a little button in order to turn the wheel, but you turn it until you find that M. And then you know that you will have your camera in manual mode. And so once you've got that done, then you'll be in manual mode, and we can begin to talk about settings. Also, just one last note here, as you can see on the PowerPoint, most cameras are also going to have a mode indicator in the viewfinder itself, or maybe on the back screen of the camera. You might find it there, and you'll be able to see that information and be able to tell what mode your camera is in those ways as well. And so before we jump into the main body of the lecture, I want to talk to you about autofocus. Autofocus is a pretty big deal. Now, you might not even realize that your camera is autofocusing. You just might pick your camera up and you don't even think about focus, and you go ahead and shoot the picture, and that's good, because that means that autofocus is working. Now, at this level, an introductory photography class, we're not going to get into all the fine nuances of how to fine-tune autofocus systems and how to switch your autofocus from one button to another, and all of these sorts of things. Those are wonderful things, and they will be worth your exploration. But for our purposes, I'm just going to really briefly go over the various modes of autofocus and what they mean, and then we're going to just talk about two of those because I want to help you do something that a lot of young photographers struggle with when it comes to autofocus. And so, and then once we're done talking about autofocus, we're going to jump into what I call the big three. Okay, it's going to be fun. So the first type of autofocus that is common is called continuous autofocus. Now, this continuous autofocus means that as long as you have your finger held halfway down on the button, your shutter button to take the picture, wherever you move your camera, whenever you move your camera, as long as your shutter button is held halfway down, it's just going to continue to focus on whatever you happen to be shooting at. The benefit of continuous autofocus is pretty obvious. A lot of people use just continuous autofocus and don't use any other mode, and it's easy to see the appeal of that. But one of the major benefits is if you're photographing something that's moving, or you're photographing as you're moving, and especially birds in flight, because you can hold down the shutter button and the focus just changes as your subject moves farther and closer away from the camera. And so that's what continuous autofocus is, and that's the benefit of it. And then secondly, there's single autofocus. Now this means that when you focus on something and you touch that shutter button, it focuses in on that. And then no matter where you move, if you're holding that shutter button down, no matter where you move the camera, the focus stays on that initial thing that you focused on until you let go of the button and touch it again in order to refocus on something else. So that's single autofocus. The next one is called automatic autofocus. And if you've never thought much about autofocus at all and never played with it, then your camera probably defaults to this. And your camera just chooses which autofocus mode to use in there. So it's not really a mode in and of itself. It's just your camera's mechanism to automatically choose a mode that works for whatever it senses that you're shooting. And then the last one isn't really autofocus at all, but is a type of focus, and that is manual focus. And now a lot of modern lenses still have manual focus on it, and there's still really many wonderful practical usage for manually focusing your lens, and a lot of people just like it. But there's all sorts of really good reasons to use manual focus, but there are some modern lenses who do not have the ability to do that, and some lenses have a little switch on the side that might switch between autofocus and manual focus. So those are the main ideas about focusing. But what I mentioned earlier, I want to talk to you about these two top ones, A and B, continuous autofocus and single autofocus. These are the two main ones that we're going to be using most of the time. And so and I want to share something with you with regard to one of those that is really, really cool. Now, let me ask you a question. Has there ever been a time when you have been photographing and you're focusing by pressing your shutter button halfway down, you're focusing, and you see something in the foreground closer to you that you really, really want to focus on, and so you point your camera down to that, and you hold your shutter button halfway down, and it focuses on that, and you're like, okay, cool. But you don't want the whole picture to be that. You just want that to really be the focus. And so then you move your camera up, and when you touch the focus button again, it refocuses the whole thing. If you haven't experienced that, then you're going to experience that at some point. And I want to just give you a little inside tip on how to avoid that. So let's say, for example, and let's just continue using the example that I just brought up. Let's say, for example, there is something in the foreground that you really want to emphasize and you really want to focus, and you're not so concerned about the background being in perfectly sharp focus. And matter of fact, you might want it to be just a little blurry, a little out of focus, so that what's in the foreground will be emphasized. There's artistic reasons for doing that, and that's what you're trying to accomplish. And so if you have your camera in single autofocus, and this is a good reason to not always have it in continuous autofocus. If you have your camera in single autofocus, you can point your camera down, touch the shutter button, and hold it, and get that in focus. And then when you lift your camera up to get the whole scene in, you can move it around to get that little bit in the foreground that you want to emphasize, put it right where you want it, and still holding the shutter button halfway down, then the focus does not change. What you focused on initially will still be in focus as long as you're holding that shutter button halfway down, and when you get ready, you push it the rest of the way down to take the photo. And so that's just a little inside tip there. It's a great little technique that you can use to avoid that problem, because you will encounter that sooner or later. And just one last thing about autofocus. Most cameras will have an autofocus indicator, in other words, a way to know what autofocus mode you're in. You'll either see it in your viewfinder itself, or on the back screen, or maybe on the LCD screen that you just saw earlier on my camera. Many cameras have these little LCD screens on top of the body. That's also another little screen, and when your camera's turned on, it will show you what autofocus mode you're in there as well. So now we're going to shift gears a little bit and talk about correct exposure. Photography, at its most basic understanding, is the art of manipulating or controlling light. I mean, that's what we're doing in photography. We're manipulating and controlling light. That's what it is at its essence. Digital cameras have these things known as sensors, electronic sensors, which are exposed to the light. When you press that shutter button, light comes through the lens via the shutter, and then ultimately a digital photo is produced as a result of all that. So basically speaking, when an image is said to be correctly exposed, that means that it's not too light or it's not too dark, that you want a correct exposure. And so the manual mode in our camera has a very specific way of doing that, and that is with the built-in light meters that our cameras have. And all cameras have these. And I'm just going to give you some examples of what your camera's light meter might look like. This first one, you might see this type of thing across the bottom of your viewfinder, and you might also see, if you have an older camera or a different model camera, or maybe not such a common model, you might see your light meter over here on the right hand side of your viewfinder as you're looking through the camera, or you can see your light meter right here on the back screen of your camera. This one happens to be a Canon. And by the way, on the back screen of a lot of Canon models, the back screen on a lot of Canon models will have the light meter as you see here, but after a few seconds it goes away. And the way that you get that to come back is by touching the shutter button again, and it will pop back on there. Or you could do what I'm teaching you in this class and just look through the viewfinder, and then it never goes away in there. So that's some ideas about light meter, but I don't want to just show you what light meters look like. I want to show you what we are looking for in order to get the right exposure, a correct exposure, not too light, not too dark, with our light meters. And so if you look at where this red circle is, you will see there are two kind of arrows that are pointing toward each other, pointing at each other. The one on the bottom moves around. As you are adjusting your camera, that will move around. And so the idea is you want to make camera adjustments until that little needle or arrow on the bottom lines up perfectly with the one on the top. And then when you take the photo, you will get a good exposure, a correct exposure. It won't be too light and it won't be too dark. Okay? So now I want to talk to you about the three main settings, the big three. And this is what we're going to spend most of our time on today. The big three camera settings are aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. And if you look through your viewfinder, you'll be able to see each one of these on there. Okay, so first off, this is, if you're looking at your aperture, you're always going to see it with an F in front of it. We're going to talk about exactly what your aperture is here in just a second, but this is where your aperture would be. It'll always have an F in front of it because aperture settings are known as f-stops, okay? And then your shutter speed will always have a slash in between two numbers, almost like a mathematical look to it, because that is measured in portions of seconds. The setting you're looking at right there is 1/30th of a second. That's what the shutter speed is set at. And then the ISO will almost always just say ISO on it, and it will be just a number by itself. In this particular case, the camera is set to ISO 100 if you look inside the red kind of oval circle there. So here's the thing about all of these settings. There's a very important common denominator between all of these settings. And that is each and every one of them, they control the amount of light that comes into the camera. They all control how much light actually reaches the center. All three of these, your aperture, your shutter speed, and your ISO, they control the light that enters the camera. So you might be thinking, well, why would we need three settings that all do the same thing? Well, that's what they have in common. That's the common denominator. But they also each have a very different effect on the outcome of every single photograph, and it's the differences between these settings that we're now going to spend the remainder of our time on. And here's the coolness of this. If you can master these three settings, just these three settings, I know there's more to photography and there's more to learn, and all that's good, but if you could just master these three settings, aperture, shutter speed, and ISO, you would make huge strides to improving your development as a photographer. And so that is why I wanted to focus on these three settings, especially here today. And so first off, as we already mentioned, we're going to talk about aperture first. Not only does your camera's aperture control light, just like the other two settings that we mentioned just a few minutes ago, but the main unique feature about your camera's aperture is it controls depth. Aperture controls depth. Similar to your eye's pupil, most lenses have an adjustable aperture inside of it that's designed to allow various amounts of light in the camera, and it's adjustable. In the old days, we had these lenses like this, and this is just an old classic Nikon 50mm. And they had these actual aperture rings on the lenses themselves that clicked. Now I'm going to get this, put this over here and see if you can just hear this. Hear those clicks on there? That was me turning this aperture ring. And as you opened and closed the aperture, I'm going to get it, see if I can get this closer to the camera now. You can look through there, and I can move this, I think. Watch this. See it? See it opening and closing? That's what's going on inside of your lens, and you might not realize it at the time, but that is your camera allowing more or less light to hit the sensor. And these aperture settings are all standardized. There's a numbering system that goes with them, and the smaller the number, the larger the opening. However, most modern lenses no longer have an actual ring on the lens. It's actually done electronically with some sort of settings that you can adjust on the camera body. And again, a lot of that is going to be down to your camera body and what those differences are. And so just to kind of give you an illustration here of what apertures look like and what they mean, this is kind of a standardized set of apertures, camera apertures. Now, in most of the settings that we're going to talk about today, there are standardized increments. In other words, this does not vary from camera to camera, from lens to lens, from manufacturer to manufacturer. There are industry standard increments, and this is so with aperture. This is so a photographer can switch cameras and go from one brand to another, one lens to another, and you'll understand what all these things mean because they're universally industry standard accepted increments. And so this is what they kind of look like. And as I mentioned, if you notice, the largest opening has the smallest number. F1.4, in this example on the screen, would allow the most amount of light in. And F16, on this example, would allow the least amount of light into your camera. And so, as I mentioned, aperture controls depth. Yes, it controls light like the other two, but it uniquely controls depth. And so what we're going to talk about now is field of focus, which is also called depth of field. And so the area of a photo that is known as the depth of field is the area that's actually in focus. And depth of field, the field of focus in your camera, is actually determined uniquely by the aperture of your lens. This is how you can control depth. You never get this when your camera is in automatic mode, but in manual mode, you can control the aperture and actually control the depth of your images, the depth of field. So in this chart that you see on the screen, the top section demonstrates a very, very shallow depth of field. If you look at this part that's in focus, it's just almost just a little ribbon of area that's in focus. So it's safe to assume here that the photographer was using a very large aperture, such as 1.4, for example, in the screen before, which showed that very large aperture. So that's why he has such a little depth of field. The bottom section, however, if you look down here, it looks like the field of focus, the focal point here is this animal that the photographer is apparently focusing on. But it looks like here that there are many things between the camera and the animal and many things after. I mean, look how far that focus actually goes. It actually comes all the way over to the side of my head. But the depth of field here is greatly increased. And so in this case, he would have used a really small lens opening, likely f/16, if we go by that chart before. So let's look at some real world examples of this though. The charts are nice and they're handy, but I want to show you the huge difference that this can make. And I hope that you're able to view these next photos on a computer screen or larger, not just a phone, because you might not notice this as much, but this is a really big deal. And so here we have, you can see at the bottom of the screen that the setting is f/22. And so what does that mean? It means that the lens setting is very, very small. So it's not letting a lot of light in. So what we have here is a photograph of my backyard here in Knoxville, Iowa. And you can see that if you look in the background, the field of focus is very deep because of f/22 here. You can see a license plate on this pickup truck. You can't read it, but you can see that there's a license plate. You can see a little child's swing here, this blue part. Over here, if you look over to the left of the screen, you can see another pickup with a nice clear red tail light visible. Okay, and of course you can see the birdhouse here that's very close to you in the foreground. So a lot of depth there with f/22. Now I want you to watch what begins to happen as we open up the aperture and allow more light, yes, but less depth. So here's f/22, which we've been looking at. Now watch this. Here is f/8. As you can see, things in the background are starting to get a little fuzzy. You can no longer see that there's even a license plate on this truck. We know that this is a child swing here because the color blue is still there. We can no longer see a nice clear picture of the tail light on this truck over here. But our birdhouse is still a nice sharp focus. But our depth of field is very shallow now. Okay, that's f/8. Now watch as we go to f/2.8. Look at that. Now the truck is a blob. You can barely see a tiny little bluish blob. You would have no idea what that is. You might be able to figure out that this is a pickup here over on the left, but there's no more view of the tail light. And so what I'm getting at here is that, and this is really, really just exciting to think about, is that we just transformed a photo that was just a simple picture of my neighborhood into a photo that was a picture of a birdhouse, isolated from all of the things around it, just by adjusting the aperture on the lens of our camera. Isn't that exciting? I mean, you can control, as a photographer, the depth of your images when your camera is in manual mode and you begin to learn how to use the aperture settings. I find that just extremely exciting. And so the next thing we're going to talk about is shutter speed. Now, shutter speed is, it's kind of like your eyelid. It opens and closes and allows light in. Shutter speed controls motion. So aperture controls depth. Shutter speed controls motion. They both control light. They all do, but uniquely, the shutter speed actually controls motion. Okay? So the rate or the speed at which your camera's shutter opens and closes, that inhibits its ability to freeze motion or to have motion blurred. Now, there's good reasons for both of those. You might think it's a negative thing for motion to be blurred, but there are artistic liberties that one could take and intentionally blur motion to show movement if you wanted to do that. But it's also very nice to be able to freeze motion when you're photographing something that you want to see clearly, such as a bird in flight. So, in other words, the faster the shutter speed, the greater chance that you're going to have to be able to freeze motion. Oops, I'm sorry, got ahead of myself here. So here is a chart that demonstrates how shutter speeds work. If you see here, this first one is 1/500th. Now, 1/500th, that equals 1/500th of a second. That's how fast your shutter is moving, opening and closing, if it says 1/500th. And so at 1/500th, with a person who's just casually walking, you would freeze them pretty good. Now, as you notice, as this gets a little slower, now you're down to 1/25th of a second over here. Now you're down to 1/60th of a second over here, and it's starting to get a little blurrier. It's getting harder to freeze the person with that shutter speed. You get down all the way to 1/2 a second, and the motion is very blurry with somebody walking like that. And I just want to add here, for your knowledge, that anytime you get below 1/60th of a second, that is what I call tripod territory. It is very difficult to hold your camera without getting some kind of motion shake when the shutter speed is 1/60th of a second or below. So if you need to keep your shutter speed down because you're not getting enough light in, and for other reasons that we'll talk about later, then you will need to put it on a tripod if you go down below 1/60th of a second. So that's just kind of an unrelated little helpful hint for you there, little rule of thumb, if you will. And so you get the idea. The slower the shutter speed, the more motion blur you will get when things are actually moving. But let's take a look at some real life examples here. Now here is one example of this pelican over the Des Moines River. This is 1/250th of a second. Now you might think 1/250th of a second, that's pretty fast. And for many things, that is pretty fast. And there are some things that might not be moving very swiftly that you could freeze at 1/250th of a second. But a bird in flight, this pelican, he was booking. I mean, he was really soaring near the surface of the water. And if you look at the photo and you look below the pelican, you can see that the water here is in sharp focus. So this isn't out of focus. The pelican is just experiencing, or we're experiencing, motion blur through our camera because 1/250th of a second was not fast enough to freeze the motion of the pelican. So let's jack it up a little bit more, take it a little faster, same subject. Here we have 1/500th of a second, and we're getting there. It's still a little blurry though, and that's not out of focus. There's still a little bit of motion blur at 1/500th of a second. And so that's pretty fast for a shutter speed, you might think, but if something's really moving, you might need to go to 1/1600th of a second, which is what I've done here. There's also increments of shutter speeds in between these. I'm just using these as an example, but this photo was shot at 1/1600th of a second for a shutter speed, and as you can see, it beautifully froze. This pelican, it almost looks like he's just kind of hanging there miraculously. But that gives you an idea of what happens with shutter speeds and how you can use them to improve your photography. So the next thing that we're going to get at is the third item, and that is ISO. Now, ISO controls noise. So aperture controls depth, shutter speed controls motion, and ISO controls noise. You might want to remember those three things. And those are the keys, really, to all of this. Those are the big three. And so let's switch back over now to the PowerPoint presentation. Let me give you some examples of what noise is. And first of all, before we really look too much into depth, you need to know that the ISO settings are also measured in standardized increments, which are universal across the spectrum, across brands, and so forth. And although ISO settings are similar to the other ones with regard to light control, they're very different in one crucial way. And so with rare exceptions, we should always attempt to keep the ISO on our camera settings as low as we can possibly get it, because it creates noise, and I'm going to show you some real life examples in a minute. So unless it becomes absolutely necessary to do otherwise, we want to keep our ISO down nice and low. If we're working in a low light situation and we can't use a flash, or we shouldn't use a flash, or we don't want to use a flash, then we may have to jack up our ISO settings in order to get enough light to take the photo, and because we won't be able to do it with just our shutter speed and our aperture alone, because we're in a low light situation. And I'm going to show you exactly what that is in just a couple of minutes. And so here on your screen, there's really no better way to tell you what noise is than to actually show it to you. Now, I don't know how many of you may or may not have seen television screens that were look like snow on them because they weren't coming in. It's probably less common these days than it used to be, but that is a really good example of what visual noise, digital noise, actually looks like. Same kind of idea here. And so with ISO, you see when it's down nice and low, ISO 50, your camera might not go down that low, many don't. ISO 100 is kind of the normal. Most cameras will only go that low. And then that's going to be your finest, the least amount of noise that your photo is going to have. And then you can get up to ISO 200, ISO 800, ISO 3200. And when you start getting up to ISOs like 12,800, in many cases, the photo becomes almost unusable. Because there's just so much noise there, and there wouldn't be very many applications where you would use an ISO that high. And so for our purposes, we want to keep the ISOs down as low as possible. So let's take a look at some real live examples of that. Okay, here is ISO 800. That may seem a little high, but in this particular photo, and I've got 3 examples of this same photo. In this particular photo, I was shooting an annual conference that I shoot, and I couldn't use flash, and it was very dark in this auditorium, and so I needed to shoot my ISO up a little bit in order to get enough light in here to get the photo. So this is not too bad at ISO 800. Now let's kind of flip through with the same, I did this with 3 different ISOs, Now here is ISO 1600, and I'm going to ask you, if you have on a computer screen, you're really going to be able to see this better. But you see this area where I'm moving my mouse cursor? Looks like a pitcher here or a carafe of some kind, and there's a travel mug over here. Now this is ISO 1600. Watch that area. I'm going to flip it back to ISO 800 where we just were. Now you see that it's nowhere as near as fuzzy. Now keep watching that area. I'm going to go back to 1600 again. Now watch that area and watch what happens when I go even higher. There is ISO 2400. That's huge difference. You can see all kinds of noise throughout the whole picture, on the side of the gentleman's face, in the areas that should be black and dark. There's all these just millions and millions of little specks, it almost looks like. That's digital noise. And the higher that we move our ISO up the scale, the more chance of us having some unappealing and undesirable digital noise. Now, in a thumbnail size photo, just a small picture, it might not make that big of a difference. But if you go up much bigger than that, you really begin to see digital noise if it's present. Okay, so let's wrap up here. And I'm going to ask you a question, and I'm going to give you the answer. So, but I want you to just think about this a little bit. Here are all 9 of the images that we've used in this presentation. What do all 9 of these images have in common? And the answer is that each and every one of these images is correctly exposed. They're not too light, they're not too dark, they're just about right, with some little bit of variance maybe, but they're pretty close. So they all are correctly exposed, we might say, and yet they all do something different. Yes, they're correctly exposed, but the birdhouse down here is a birdhouse picture because we blurred the background by opening up our aperture and creating less depth in the photo intentionally. Okay? And over here, these are all correctly exposed, but we desired to freeze the motion of this pelican, and so we moved the shutter speed up to a much higher shutter speed in order to accommodate that. And then over here, the most desirable one out of these is the one with the least noise in it, which is the one with the lowest ISO setting. So in closing, I want you to think about those 9 photos that you just saw on the screen, and I want to give you kind of the underlying thing of what kind of pulls this all together. And that is each of these camera settings, aperture, shutter speed, and ISO, each of these play off of each other. In other words, you cannot just adjust one without it affecting the other. So if you open up your lens by the setting on your camera to let more light in, then in order for you to not let too much light in, which would make the exposure not work, you have to go with a faster shutter speed. As you close down your lens, in order to get more depth, you're letting less light in the camera, and so then you will need to go with a slower shutter speed in order to bring more light in that way. The way that these settings work with each other is the most crucial part of all of this. And you begin to notice this by using these settings and by playing with them and by looking at your camera's light meter that we discussed earlier, and by bringing those 2 needles together. Once you start practicing this and learning this, you'll begin to see that when you change the aperture of your lens, you will need to change your shutter speed to compensate for it so that you can bring those 2 needles back together. They might be perfectly exposed, the 2 needles might be together just like they should be on your camera's light meter, but you want more depth in the camera, so you shut your lens down to a smaller opening, and that is going to cause the needle to move over this way, and you won't get a correct exposure unless you slow your shutter speed down to its lower settings, which will allow more light in the camera, and that bottom needle will come back over. And so you just have to play with it like that. And so not only is it important to know these three settings, but it's important to know how they interchange with each other. Okay, I think that's about it for camera settings that we're going to do as far as this lecture is concerned. Just want to say thank you very much for watching. I hope that you'll be able to get something from this lecture. I hope you'll be able to improve your photography with it. I look forward to seeing some of the images that you'll be turning in, and I'm available if you need me. Email's usually the best way, and I will try to get back with you if you have any questions or anything like that. Thank you. Thanks again, and best of luck this week.